welcome back, or welcome if this is your part 1. This is Intro to Home Recording, part 2, Processing and Editing. Last time we walked through the exciting journey of audio from whatever its source is, through a microphone, into our marvelous computers, through all the various media in between. I am Franklin Walther. What do I have this time? A little pointer. Franklin Walther, I'm the Digital Services Librarian here at the Mill Valley Public Library. And why do I get to teach such a class? Well, because I do the programming for these kinds of things, and I chose me. I've been home recording for over 20 years, and slowly gaining more knowledge. I'm a librarian. I like to sponge up as much knowledge as possible. Not a professional, never was, never been in a studio, don't play in bands, not really a musician. If I play instruments, it's to play as a producer, as a audio engineer. That's my real hobby. Which of course makes me an expert. The joke's so nice, I made it twice. Okay, let's jump into our content today. I'm set up to record, great. But what now? Your microphone's pointing to your face or your instrument or whatever. We've got our software fired up, we're all ready to go, but what do we do now? We got a new journey. I like this organization. Our 3-part journey today is record it, edit it, and render it. We're gonna grab it, we're gonna mess with it, and we're gonna bake the cake and deliver our final product. To record it, we're gonna need some software to do this. And the software we'll use is a Digital Audio Workstation, DAW, DAW. I don't know if people say DAW or DAW, so I'll probably go in between. Again, librarian, so most of the stuff I learn I read, and you don't really hear whether people say DAW or DAW. You have many choices, many choices for how you want to do this. There's a free program called Audacity that has a good reputation as being out there and free and open source, and you can record multiple tracks and do effects in real time now, so it's a little better than it used to be. If you have ponied up for an Apple thing, one of their computers or even one of their iPads, you'll have GarageBand, which is the DAW that Apple makes. And it's pretty darn good, actually. It's quite capable. If it's not enough for you as you go through your career as an audio recordist, they make something called Logic, which is super GarageBand, grown up and muscular, as I say here. The company Hindenburg, and I think it is B-U-R-G as opposed to the B-E-R-G, the airship that exploded. But don't think about that. Think about spoken word and audiobook specialized. So spoken word specialist DAW. It's used by radio journalists. If you're going to primarily be talking, you might want to look into their products. They have a whole range of more and more fancy offerings for more and more money. If you really want to shell out a lot of money, Pro Tools is, well, the tool of the pros. You'll find that in most professional studios. But I like to put a plug in for my personal favorite, the one I've used for so very long, the one I know the most about, even though I use 10% of what it can do, probably. It's called Reaper. It's pretty affordable. They'll even let you use it for free with just a little nagging in the beginning for as long as you want. And I finally ponied up for a personal license, which is 60 bucks. And we'll use it for this demonstration, again, because that's the one I know, and you didn't come here to watch me fumble with something unfamiliar, probably, unless you really just want to laugh at me, but then it's mean. Why do we need these fancy programs? Don't we have like a little press a button on your phone and you can record? Sure, you can do that, but you'll lack a lot of capabilities, fancy stuff. DAWs can record and play back multiple tracks at the same time. If you're layering up a bunch of different instruments, putting ambient sound behind your vocal recording, that sort of a thing, having a podcast where music will kind of segue you into sections. You can trim and move little clips, recordings, without destroying the original recording. We're not snipping up tape here and really committing, like when the Beatles have to mix down their audio, bounce it down onto one track to fit in more because they're so limited. We don't have to do that. We have luxury now. When we trim our clips and choose our starts and stops in our software, that doesn't affect the original file. It's just all sort of a plan, a recipe for how we're going to bake that cake. I love this metaphor, apparently. You'll hear it a lot. You can handle MIDI input for your electronical keyboards that don't themselves make noise, but play imaginary virtual instruments. And then you can edit note by note if you flub one, or flub a lot, or your timing is terrible. You can make use of a wide range of plugins, and ooh, if you thought I got excited about cables, I love plugins. And these will help us enhance, sweeten, or add special effects to our audio. And then you can mix together your project and master it to the degree that we, as ordinary people, can, right there in the software. DAWs, as I said, work with tracks. So you can add a track for each independent instrument or even individual microphones on an instrument if you're getting fancy and pointing a lot at one. Because we're using our magical computers, we're not limited to 2 or 4 tracks like those poor Beatles in the early going that I mentioned. We can go wild. The YouTube videos I've watched of professional producers showing their projects, they have a ludicrous number of tracks, each doing some purpose-built little things. They'll have 80 tracks or something. Seems like showing off to me. I work in the much less professional range of a few tracks, but the point is you can have as many as you want with today's modern whiz-bang computers. We can pan those tracks around so they sound like they're coming more to the left and more to the right, which will help us make sense of everything all together. We can mute a track so we don't hear it. We can solo it so we don't hear the other tracks and we just hear that track if we're focusing on it. We can arm them to record so we can record one or many at the same time. Depending on your interface, it may take several inputs at the same time. So you've got your multiple microphones all going at the same time and grabbing audio from all of them at the same time, if that's applicable to what you're doing. You can send them into buses. You can route these tracks around in, again, in freewheeling digital imaginary fashion. Group them together, apply an effect to multiple at the same time. Control the overall volume of a whole bunch of tracks at the same time by putting them through a bus or grouping them together. And you can monitor, that is, you hear what's being recorded in the DAW too. But if your interface does this, just a little tip, if your interface does this itself, don't have both of these features on at the same time. There's going to be a little bit of a delay in getting the audio into the software and back out to you. It's preferable to get the really low latency monitoring off your device. And if you have both going on, you'll hear both, and it'll be weird, like me, like hearing me and hearing a ever so slightly delayed me going through a bunch of equipment. A little weird. It's not really blowing my mind. If it were a little bit more of a delay, you start to go a little crazy. I have a demonstration of all the stuff we'll go through, and in former classes I would flip back and forth, and I'd confuse myself and I think everyone else. So we'll go through the concepts, and then we'll take a look at them all in action in a little sample project I have. In case you're like, well, show me. I will. Most other features. Most DAWs will include a metronome to help you stay in time, or as best as you can, again, if you're me. And they may include a pre-roll measure before recording begins. That may be on by default, like in GarageBand, where it doesn't make sense if you're recording a podcast. So know about that feature and turn it off if it's not applicable. On that note, the DAW's timeline can be broken into measures and beats because you can set the tempo, which will help you with the whole metronome concept. You could specify the tempo of your song and see the measures all broken out. If you're not doing a song, you'll be able to switch it to minutes and seconds, which is a little more sensible for your spoken word stuff, of course. Unless you're speaking in perfect rhythm at 98 beats per minute. Okay, features. Now we're going to edit that audio that we grabbed. We can trim and move our clips. Your DAW, DAW, will allow you to trim the beginning and end of clips so we can cut out extraneous junk like me, law. That stuff before your recording or your chair squeaking as you get settled and you're ready to play your instrument. You can trim that stuff out. You can trim your profanity at the end if you mess something up. What we can do that very easily by just clicking and dragging the beginning and end. And you'll see that they make it easy. Again, no finding that point in the tape and snipping it or razoring it or whatever. We can also do things like fade in or fade out to the beginning and the end of our clips. This can help avoid the weird and noticeable sudden stop of sound or sudden beginning of sound. There, you'll see those lovely crossfade indicators showing that the volume of one thing is going up, the volume of the other is going down. This is also a way you can have two things just sort of nicely hand off to each other. If you record just a piece that you flubbed on the first try, but the rest of the take is great. This could be one way to blend those back together. And you can move your clips around to and fro, copy and paste and repeat. If it's a drum loop or something that you're using, or a recurring bit of music in your podcast. Look at this beautiful rack of all these fancy bits of outboard gear, they call it. Since those glorious all-analog days, manufacturers have made all these units that do all kinds of processing to audio. They use real electronic circuits, vacuum tubes, transistors, and secret magic. There are lots of very well-known pieces of equipment that everyone will salivate over just thinking about. Slight problem, they're basically all extremely hellaciously expensive. And this is a real commitment. There's tens of thousands of dollars probably in the rack of this, and the rack looks pretty nice too. It's expensive. We're probably not that loaded here if we're just like feeling this out and we're beginners here. Yeesh. What can we do about it? Again, we'll turn to our friend, the computer. We can fake it with digital versions of processors that do the same sort of thing. And good news, your DAW will come with a lot of these already, a lot of the key ones we're going to use. So you don't even have to dive into the world of extra ones quite yet. Master what they do before you dip your toe out in the waters. But once you want to dip your toe, boy, can you. Whole bunch of paid plugins out there, like lots, and a whole bunch of free ones. I, the poorly paid librarian, with many interests and lots of stuff that I've filled my house with, don't have a lot of money to slosh around on plugins, so I love finding a good free one. And there's all sorts of people developing their coding skills and doing it because they want to, or on a Patreon model, or anything like that. You can find a whole bunch of really cool stuff for free. Makes me feel good. I said go. Let's look at a few categories of these processors, because they all do wonderful things for us. First of all, equalization, or EQ for short. Probably familiar with on your home stereo, or cars from the early 90s may have had these. A EQ example here. What are these exactly? They raise or lower the volume of different parts of that frequency spectrum, from the low to the high, up to your really high frequency sibilants and piccolos playing the highest note. So we can emphasize or reduce those low frequencies, middle frequencies, or high frequencies, the bass and the treble. They might be really simple, like a bass and a treble knob, or even just a tone knob that kind of affects both at the same time, like a teeter-totter, or they could get fancy. We can do this to correct for bottom-heavy sounds, top-heavy sounds, so everyone can meld, or to achieve certain effects, or to make room for each other. All are parts of the recording. Let's look at two kinds of EQ. We have graphic EQs, this cute little smiling friend over here on the left. They have sliders, and each of these sliders affects a certain slice of the audio spectrum. You might find rack-mounted ones that have 31 sections of an audio spectrum. And so you can affect a little bit of it with a little blending to the next octave or half octave or third octave or whatever. And you can make them smile, which is cute. And people like to do this because it makes the bass more bassy and the high more high-E. But we're going to be fancy and use a parametric equalizer. Parametric because there are parameters. There are more controls, more knobs and things to twiddle, types of points and stuff. There are other kinds too, simple tilt equalizers, that's like your tone knob. Something called a linear phase EQ because slight phase differences in time are introduced when you when you use an EQ on a certain part of the spectrum. I can't hear it. I mean, these super taster audio engineers can, but I don't mess with one of those, let me tell you. A lot of us will be recording voice, and so to introduce the idea of different parts of the spectrum and what they give us, what they feel like, what they sound like. EQ is best applied sparingly. We don't want to go wild, generally. But almost always we're going to do, something we'll do on most sources is to cut out the very, very low frequency stuff. I think I mentioned last time that your microphone might have a switch that does this already. If we're talking below about 100 hertz, there's really not much, 100 cycles per second, there's not much in the human voice that's interesting there. What there may be is rumble from mic stands being touched or something like that, or just a rumble from the room, the HVAC system, or who knows what. It's not going to be of interest to you, really, in your voice. So we'll generally roll that off. And there's my pointer. So this is a chart here that I shamelessly stole about some of the ranges, the frequency ranges in human voice and what this might be connected to. Down in the bottom, if we want to add some warmth and fullness to this voice, there's the frequency range we might give a little gentle boost to. But if there's boominess or small room resonance, might cut in that area. Places to increase clarity. And these are, it's all subjective, but this is probably a good guide. If you need a little more clarity, try that range. Presence, to open up the vocal. Brightness, and then the really high-end stuff is called air. And again, if there's a problem in that area, this is like if someone sounds very nasal, I do, but I just always do. You can remove some of that nasal tone and ameliorate some of the irritating parts of the spectrum you might hear based on the person, the recording environment, the microphone, the equipment, etc., etc. A good rule of thumb is to cut narrow and boost wide. What does that mean? If you're going to give something a boost, make that a nice, wide, gentle one. And we'll look at that in the EQ, just what control you twiddle to do that. If you're going to cut, it's wise to cut a more narrow, focused part. And this is both to avoid some weirdness. If you boost in a very narrow way, it'll add these odd resonances and emphasize sound in a very unnatural way. Whereas if you're trying to cut out a problem part, we don't want to cut out too much. It'll start to sound hollow and strange in a different way. And don't forget, you'll be getting the whole presentation. You don't have to copy down the whole chart. That's in your digital doggy bag that'll go out via email. EQ. We can do other things to the audio too. We'll work on our dynamics. What do I mean by that? The difference between the loud stuff and the quiet stuff. Like I said last time, the human voice is notoriously dynamic. When we're loud, we're real loud, and when we're quiet, we're real quiet. You'll find if you start doing vocal recording. There's, of course, we could turn that volume up and down along the way afterward in our software, but on a more second to second, even microsecond to microsecond level, we can automate this with a robot. We can hand this off to a thing called a compressor. It's compression. That takes the loud parts of the signal and the quieter parts, brings them closer together. There's a couple ways to do that. There could be upward compression that boosts the low stuff, but more often you'll see compression that makes the high stuff less high in a certain way. It's very useful, used all over the place. on most sources, at least a little bit, and even the whole mix together to glue it together. How do they work? You'll set something called a threshold, and that's the little threshold. It'll be going up and down in the output level here. And once audio coming in goes above that level, ordinarily it would just keep going, right, on this graph. That's untouched. But what a compressor will do is when audio goes over that threshold, it'll start reducing. Where it would go up that much, it will go up less. You'll get a ratio control to control how sharply that's rolled off. 2-to-1 is pretty gentle. Here's a 5-to-1. It'll be a bit. The more hard this is, the more you'll notice that something's going on, right? 10-to-1, 20-to-1, those are pretty hard. And you'll do some twiddling if you want to try and make those more transparent. If you want audio to stop entirely at a certain level, that's a limiter. It's compression too, but the ratio is basically a gazillion to 1. The audio will not go above that. So that's really good to add to the very end of everything to avoid that horrible digital clipping. The end of the whole mix, really. So how hard it hits those breaks on audio getting louder is determined by that threshold. I mean, by that ratio. The ratio. The threshold tells it when it starts doing it. But wait, there's more. There are 2 more controls you'll usually have: attack and release times. And that's how quickly does the compressor like start doing its job? Does it let audio through and it's a little lenient and then it'll start, you know, squishing it down? Or is it really on its game and no peaks and sudden claps and stuff are getting through me? No, sir. And release is how quickly it'll let go and just let the audio signal go back to untouched. So here, the attack time would be how quickly it is before it starts doing its work. Release time, after the sound goes back under the threshold, how quickly does it take its hands off again? We can fuss over that, but in general, fast attacks and releases are good for responding to fast changes in sound, like snipping transients, but slower ones sound less obvious. So say the human voice, something we're very attuned to. If you want to do more general leveling out of it, you may want to do some, well, I think voice is a little different actually. Let's say a bass guitar or something like that, where there's not a whole lot of dynamics. Slower attack and release times will smooth things out a little less noticeably. There are a few types of compressors, and this is from the old hardware days when we had to achieve this effect with circuits and bits and doodads. Not bits digitally, but things, electronic components. So a few different ways to apply this compression effect. And the point in going through them is that they behave in different ways and they ended up being used for different things. So it can influence your choice of your controls or even your imaginary plugin. Voltage-controlled amplifiers and field effect transistor-based units, they tend to be quite quick in responding to transients, and certainly a well-known FET one, the 1176 limiting amplifier up there, can respond very quickly, and if you drive audio signals into it, it can saturate quite nicely and add some harmonic richness to your sound. Again, more of that analog warmth that everyone's after. Down here is another very famous compressor, an LA2A limiting amplifier that uses an optoelectric circuit. So a little light shines and then a little light measurer reacts to tamp that signal down, to do the compression work, to tell the unit to do the compression work. It's inherently a little slower to respond. So this tends to be a little more smooth in nature compared to a really sharp, snappy compressor. Fascinating, but the takeaway is compressors will sound and act differently and are better for different material based on those settings and those capabilities. Delays. Now we get into our time-based things we can do to our audio. Is there an echo in here, 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 here? That's a delay. Delays just repeat the audio signal, and according to a whole bunch of parameters that you can set too. You can have one quick delay, like I'm getting here, a slapback delay, one quick one. In your rockabilly songs, you'll hear this a lot, as a vocal effect, or on guitars and things. So there's just one echo, one quick echo within 100 and something milliseconds, and then no more. Or you can have a trail of echoes, 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 and have them fade off into silence, or stay the same level for some weird effect, or get louder even. Originally, you'd have loops of tape that would just go through, and you'd write to them and play them at the same time. You could accomplish that way. There's you can make an electronic circuit that kind of store the audio information in capacitors and then release it. Then they came out with digital delays that can get a very pristine, perfect sound, although those analog ones, people also like the sound of those delays getting warmer and washier as they go on. But now, of course, we can emulate the characteristics of the physical types with our magic computers. Your parameters would be your delay time, usually in milliseconds, maybe in note lengths if your plugin supports that and you're working in a music context. Feedback is how quickly those echoes fade away. Is it echo, echo, or echo, 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 echo? That'd be your feedback. And then mix, how loud is the original signal versus that first echo that comes back? Are they basically the same, or just a subtle little echo you hear? You could also take a whole bunch of echoes, really so many echoes, and smear them all together and get a reverb. Get a gazillion delays and blend them together, and it gives the impression of the way sound bounces off various things and returns to you in a large space. You can make it sound like you're in a large room, or a hall, or a cave, or whatever, by twiddling more parameters. Reverb's used a lot in music, of course, and more than you might think, in very subtle ways, too. Can sort of thicken things up a bit. It can make your ear notice, or your brain notice less that things feel or sound like they're in different spaces. It can kind of blend a few sources together. And reverb can work as a couple of different kinds of effect, which you can place these effects and have them affect the audio in a couple of different ways. Insert, that word there, an insert effect is inserted into one track, affects whatever's going on in that track. Or you can use a send effect, which makes sense if you think about it. There's an effect sitting over on some other track. You can send the audio into it. Reverbs are often used like this. And that way you can also send the audio from many tracks into that reverb and put them all through it. And your controls for the reverb will usually be decay time, how big this space is. Is it like a cathedral where this reverb tail goes on for very long? Or is it like a small little bathroom you're confined in? You can filter out the low-end stuff or the high-end stuff if you get a lot of boom coming back, or weird artificial spiky sizzle, or it doesn't sound like the space you want it to sound like. And then mix it in with how much of the original signal versus how much reverb. If you go beyond about 25% of the original signal, you gotta be wanting to do that for an effect, because it'll sound very reverby. A light touch is generally best. You could do all of the above. I showed some physical units that are mixers and interfaces all at the same time last time. And just to slightly demystify those gazillion knobs you see on these things, this is just a lot of these processors in a row, kind of flowing down. If you plug your microphone in here, or your line instrument, there's a whole bunch of steps to go through, kind of in a vertical order. Audio goes in, you might filter it. There's a little button here for the low cut, and I don't know what, that's probably another filter or something, or some special feature. Oh, we've got our preamp gain, of course, here. But then into those filters, cut out the bottom end. We can do that right here. Here it's just a button, might be a control you can change. This one has a one knob compressor. So not a lot of fancy control over the times and such, but just more compression or less. Into EQ. Here's a parametric EQ. It might have a fixed low and high, and you can just kind of work on all those with some shelves, but then sweep around a middle to find a place you want to boost or pull down, and then decide how tight or wide that would be. Next comes your routing, sending this audio elsewhere into some bus that you can affect, or sometimes a special effects bus on these devices. Then you can pan it around right and left. And with our fader down here, or you can mute it and that sort of thing. And your fader down here will decide its relative level based compared to the other tracks. So that is all this stuff in physical form. We're going to do it in digital form here. Editing, mixing it up. Okay, mixing multiple sources together. First of all, if you are doing a podcast, if you are doing a radio journalist type of stuff, why would you mix audio there? It seems like it's pretty simple, but there you can illustrate with sound. You can add little beds of ambiance to communicate a space you're in. Hear the birds chirping outside if that's where you are, or underlay the sounds of the city. Musical intros that you have can fade out gently and let the voices come in. You can use automation to control the levels of things over time. Do something like duck that musical theme under the person talking at the beginning, so you're not fighting with your theme. You hear your music play, the music goes down to make room for you, saying, "Welcome to whatever podcast this is. Today on the show will be blip, blip, blip." And then the music comes back up before it fades away, and you get into the business. Why our most recent library podcast, which is a recording of talks that go on in here, author talks. That's how we set it up to start. So yeah, we can fade in and fade out, but then use automation as well during to change volume up and down, time-based, reacting to something else. If you don't want to get started podcasting, I know it's aimed at students and kids, but we'll start somewhere. And NPR has a lot of great tutorials and resources on getting started with your podcast and recording. You know, they do a bit of that themselves. Here's another fun diagram. Let's say you're doing more complicated stuff, music. You have a few ways you can cram all these multiple instruments and sources you might have into a mix. One, pan them around, right? In the stereo field, have some sitting over here and some sitting over here. So they're not all on top of each other. Although, of course, people made mixes in mono in the good old days, and you could do that too, nothing wrong with that. But it's one option to spread things out, you know, create effects that some things are over there, over there. You can also EQ your way into everybody living happily together. We can cut out undesired frequencies out of sources so that other sources can occupy that part. A good example is the kick drum, if you've got a drum kit, and your bass guitar. They might fight over some of that low end. So what you might do to your kick drum is keep the very low part that'll really, you know, give you the feeling, punch you in the gut. Boom, boom, boom. And maybe some stuff higher up, the little click of the beater hitting that drum. And then kind of scoop out some other stuff in between, because that's where the melodic content or of the bass will be. And you can hear that bass line going boop, 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 without it having to fight for that space with the kick drum and getting all muddy together. Yeah, so you can like carve out, let the important parts of the spectrum for one instrument or element shine, while the unimportant parts of the other ones are kind of tamped down a little, not cut out entirely, but just they step back a little and make room. That's another good metaphor. Back in the old one microphone, everyone gathers around it days, to change the level and make room for a soloist. Other people might actually just step back, control all this with distance from the microphone. And we can do that with changing the level of the tracks with our various faders. So this is kind of an interesting plot of how you might arrange a mix. You can see from the low end of the spectrum all the way up to the high where these instruments might live, where the main part of what we want to hear for them lives. And then in the left to right stereo spectrum where you might put stuff. Usually drums, the drummy drums, are right down the middle along with your vocals, right up front and center and bass, and then a little spread of the cymbals and things. And instruments might occupy different parts of that soundstage left to right, and then where they jump on each other, you might make room with EQ or spread them apart. You have a lot of tools to make things work together. A few tips on doing that. Mix with the most accurate speakers you have. Studio monitors are special speakers that instead of we're going to make your music sound good, the idea is we're going to make your music sound accurate. We're going to accurately reflect what you're doing here. And you want to hear the full range to ensure there's not a buildup of frequencies that you can't hear, right? If you have a little speaker that just can't make those low end sounds, you don't really know if you're adding way too much low end, right? When you get your nice speakers, it's a good idea to be at the bottom of a triangle, like an equilateral triangle ideally, with the speakers pointing at you and the little tweeters, the little high-end elements going right to your ears, because that high frequency sound is very directional. And you want to get it right in the ear holes, and low frequency sound tends to be less directional. It seems like it doesn't seem so much like it's coming from a certain point to our brains. Now, when we're mixing and doing all this EQ and stuff, some will rely on seeing the frequency readouts, a plot of what's going on, real-time analysis. Some insist, no, man, you got to use just your ears. Don't rely on looking at stuff, it's deceptive. And I find the older I get, the more of these, it's exactly this way or exactly the polar opposite arguments are usually wrong, and you can find plenty of middle ground. I do both, and I won't ignore, if something looks from the frequency spectrum that it's working, but then it doesn't sound good, I won't ignore my auditory information. But I certainly, as someone who does not have a trained ear, it helps to see what's going on too. Those ears of yours will get fatigued. You're working away on something for a long time. Take a break, rest and reset, and then when you come back, you might be surprised. Oh, that does not sound like I thought it did, because I had been listening for so long that I got in this kind of groove, mentally or physically in your ears, or I don't know exactly how that works, but it sure makes a difference. I've been very surprised sometimes, unhappily surprised, when I come back to something I thought, yeah, this is rocking, this sounds great, and it didn't. When you're using your effects, I know it's exciting to throw on a bunch, apply too much and get the sense of what it does to the sound, and then back way off until you're like, I don't even hear it at all. And then creep ever so slightly up until you hear it just a bit. Then maybe even back off a little bit from that. That's when I come back to a mix and I'll hear, oh my God, I thought that was a proper amount of reverb. It sounds horrible. And some people work on each track in isolation. I really want to dial in this bass sound before putting it in with the rest of the mix. Some people say, no, you got to mix the whole thing together because that's how people will be hearing it. Again, find your preference. None of us, it probably is not our jobs here. Our livelihood does not depend on getting everything professional. But find what works for you. And wait, there was something I wanted to add. I don't know. It left. Tweet. Finally, we get to the mastering part. This is the final polish on the whole mix. We've worked on it, we've gone away from it and come back. Oh, that's what I remembered. When you've got your mix and you think this is sounding great, you want to take, well, you'll render it, and you'll take that to other listening setups. Take it to your car, listen to it in there. Listen to it on different audio systems. Listen to it on compromised little small speakers that can't reproduce the whole range. Find out if you have some blind spots about parts that sound bad on other systems. If your podcast, if people are listening to it in the car and the voices have way too much boomy bass and people can't make it out, or you didn't get your compression right and a car is a great way of telling that the human voice is really dynamic, because they're like, what's happening? Turn up, and then people laugh and it blows your hair back. That'll really let you know that you haven't evened things out quite enough. Other listening environments will teach you something real fast. Okay, to master, our final polish. Now, there are mixing engineers and mastering engineers, and mastering engineers are they're kind of these wizards, these super tasters. It's the final process of tweaking and working on the whole mix to get a finished product that you're going to deliver to the customers. These mastering engineers, they'll use special EQs, extremely expensive and delicate, careful compressors and other wizardly tools. And most of all, they have amazing ears. They probably insure their ears for $1 million, that kind of thing. We don't have those. When we master our record, unless you're in the position to ship your mix out to a mastering house or engineer or one of these, I'm sure there's all kinds of people making a quick buck saying, we'll use AI to master your recording. But AI still puts too many fingers on people's hands, so I don't know. So if you're in a position to ship your stuff out to a mastering engineer, great. I'm not. We're probably not. But we should come back and take a final listen and prep it for being finalized. Some gentle little changes in overall EQ, a gentle bit of compression to kind of glue everything together, to affect everything all at the same time. Very gentle compression. Mixed to a certain loudness level if you can. And this doesn't just mean what's the loudest part of the audio. Loudness is a whole thing. It's like a psychoacoustic understanding of what we experience as loud. I'll show you a plugin at the end of the chain here when we do the actual demonstration. And that gives you a better idea of the overall loudness of the signal, and you'll hear like a big boomy sound having more energy than a little whispery sound, a little high-end sound. So it's a better idea of, rather than just watching those meters, which just show the peaks of energy, getting a better overall idea. And at the very end, you'll want to limit your audio, just in case any of those peaks are still slipping up above the 0 dB full scale digital limit. You don't want any clipping at the very end. So one of those limiters doing just a little bit of work at the end can get your product ready. Once it's as good as you can make it, we render it. And this is my bake the cake metaphor. Up till now, we've been doing a recipe. Everything we tell the DAW to do, every effect we apply, all that, all reversible, all changeable, all not committed to. Now we commit. Now it's time for commitment. We're going to bake this cake. You've mixed, you've mastered, you're ready. We're going to make a final file. We'll need to choose a type of file. WAV is a format that's lossless, pristine. No information is thrown away. It could be 16-bit or 24-bit or more, and that is the word length, and it can help give finer gradations in volume. And then the other metric is the sample rate. So how loud or quiet and how many levels of precision we have in there, that's determined by the bit word length. And then sample rate is how many times in a second do we get a picture of that to take our waveform and make it a digital representation. With both of these, the bigger the numbers, the better, although they'll end up probably at 16-bit and 44 kilohertz. This was CD quality sound. And if you're doing real audiophile stuff, you might want more. When you work on recording your audio, it's great to do 24-bit and higher sampling rates and all that. But when we bake the cake, we're probably going to end up here at 16 and 44.1 kilohertz. That's a wave. Great. Lossless, wow, beautiful. MP3s you've heard of. These will give smaller file sizes, but you do lose some information. It's like a JPEG for pictures where there's not the whole, they'll use math to tell you, well, there's going to be 4 red pixels instead of this pixel is red, this pixel is red, this pixel is red. And in the same way, it's ways of crunching down the amount of data that's used, but still getting pretty much the same result when it's expanded back out. And you can do this at different quality rates, and that's measured in bit rate, how much data is going through here. Audio material type will dictate the best practices for that, because you can set this as you're rendering. I'll do 96 kilobits per second and mono for a podcast if there's not a lot of musical content in it. That'll do pretty well, and then you get a nice small file. It's easy to stream. It's easy to send around. But MP3s can go up to 320 kilobits per second and do stereo. And that will get your music sounding its best. Particularly the high-end cymbals and stuff. If you do a really low bit rate, that's going to sound horrible and weird and like a bad cell phone call. Lots of digital artifacting. And you might be able to have your DAW normalize this whole recording to a certain loudness level after it renders. Before we get to podcasting, I now want to actually show, there we go, some examples of this going on. This is my demo project that I put together, and we can do a little fancy zooming in. I've got clips and tracks. Well, let's zoom back out. I've got all these little clips recorded here. I've got all these tracks that I've named, a drum loop and some bass and guitars and whatever. But here's a little vocal test. Let me zoom in on my audio here. A little vocal test. I was just reading a part out of a audio book.
Sometimes a mix needs some high-frequency air around 10 kilohertz or above to open it up a bit, but those frequencies could make the mix too harsh when the cymbals really fire. Setting a dynamic EQ to dip slightly whenever the cymbals play will keep the air frequencies lively.
Yeah. So one thing I could do is do my trimming. I turn off this snapping. Oh, here's a good example. This is still set for music. I'm going to switch that to minutes, seconds. As you can see, Reaper does a lot. All these menus are a gazillion things, but I'm only going to use it for the core functions here. All right, I can change my beginning and ending. I could even do a little bit of a fade in case there's some background noise so that it's not so noticeable when this track comes in.
Sometimes a mix needs...
Let's say I want to do stuff to it. I've got some effects here that I've lined up to demonstrate some, but none of them are on right now. Let's first look at an EQ. I like this one because it shows you what it's doing. And I can see here.
Sometimes a mix needs some high-frequency air around 10 kilohertz or above to open it up a bit, but those frequencies could make the mix too harsh.
There are the frequencies going on in what I'm saying.
Sometimes a mix needs some high-frequency.
There are those super low ones that we don't want. I'll turn on the high-pass filter, and see it just rolls off the low.
Sometimes a mix needs some high-frequency air around.
To demonstrate what if you really crank it up.
Sometimes a mix needs some high-frequency air around
all
10
that low end is
kilohertz
going,
or
and it
above
starts to sound weird.
to open it up a bit. But
Sounds
those
like I'm on the
frequencies
telephone.
could make the mix too harsh when the cymbals really.
We pull that back down to about 100 hertz, and we're not really missing anything that's not there. I could further tweak it.
Sometimes a mix needs some high-frequency air around 10 kilohertz or above to open it up a bit.
And I'll have my controls to tighten or widen, how much of the range that affects, right?
Sometimes a mix needs some high-frequency air around 10 kilohertz or above to open it up a bit.
Here's an
But those
example
frequencies could make the mix too harsh when the cymbals really fire.
So that's how it sounds weird when you have a sharp peak going up. And you can also shelf. Bizarre. You can also shelve frequencies so they all go down after a certain point. Okay. Leave that on. And now a compressor.
Sometimes a mix needs some high-frequency air around 10 kilohertz.
We will turn this puppy on.
Sometimes a mix needs some high-frequency air around 10 kilohertz or above to open it up a bit. But those frequencies could make...
Again, I'll make it do way too much, and then we will see a little bit more subtle settings. So right now,
sometimes a mix needs some high frequency.
See how that needle is
air
going? That shows how
around
much
10
it's
kilohertz or
reducing the
above
sound
to
over
open it
that
up a bit.
threshold.
But those frequencies could make the mix too harsh when the cymbals really fire. Setting a dynamic EQ to dip slightly whenever the...
Does not sound natural, as you may notice.
Sometimes a mix needs some high-frequency air around 10 kilohertz or above to open it up a bit, but those frequencies could make the mix too harsh when the cymbals really fire.
This is an emulation of a fast compressor. This one's a bit slower.
Sometimes a
and
mix
smoother.
needs some high-frequency air around 10 kilohertz or above to open it up a bit, but those frequencies could make the mix...
And you might even do both. This one, and these are all just examples. You can set a fast compressor first to snip off the really big peaks, and then feed it into another one to smooth everything out a little bit. Like I'd choose the easygoing opto model and maybe lower my times, attack and release there, to get the effect of both going on. We could turn on a delay.
Sometimes a mix needs some high-frequency air around 10 kilohertz or above to open it up,
if we wanted to do that. And again, feedback will...
Sometimes a mix needs some high-frequency air around 10 kilohertz or above to open it up a bit. But those frequencies could make the mix too harsh when the cymbals really fire. Setting a dynamic EQ to dip slightly whenever the cymbals play. We'll keep the air frequency.
Okay, thank you. And a reverb.
Sometimes a mix needs some high-frequency air around 10 kilohertz or above to open it up a bit, but those frequencies could make the mix too harsh when the cymbals really fire. Setting a dynamic EQ to dip slightly whenever the cymbals play will keep the air frequencies lively while taming the harshness.
Cut out some of that.
There are many uses for a dynamic EQ that can be quite helpful during mixing. The key is to get as comfortable using dynamic EQ as you are with a...
And then season to taste. And in mixing my tracks, let's say I want to make it sound like I'm reading this on the beach. I've got some beach audio here.
Sometimes a mix needs some high-frequency air around 10 kilohertz or above
In this case,
to open it up a bit, but those frequencies could make the mix too harsh.
maybe the beach is too loud, and I can use my faders down here.
Sometimes a mix needs some high-frequency air around 10 kilohertz or above.
To season to taste. You can also do an envelope and have that be automated over time. But let's move on. Let's look at our instruments here and what we might do with some of these. I'm going to solo this drum loop. Maybe throw on a compressor, and compressors done wisely to drums can make them sound more full. They, again, are incredibly dynamic. So they'll sound actually a little anemic if you just have some sharp peaks and then much of the rest of the sound is low. They'll kind of be weak, but we can even that out a bit and boost it up together. get them to blend. Got some keys here. They're way too loud, right? So I can just pull that down. I might want to have some fancy effects on those. A special time-based effect called a chorus. Or a reverb. Right? We've got a couple of guitars here. Way too loud. And I might want to pull them to either side. And my bass here. Let's see what's going on with that buddy. Might want to roll off the high-end stuff. So we can see it's doing a little work here to even out the sound of the bass. This may all be subtle and kind of hard to hear through these speakers. But, okay, so let's say I've tweaked these enough. And now I want to consider the whole thing. You notice that on my main or master track here, we've got a little red indicator. We're getting a little too spicy over there. It's letting us know. Inside the DAW, you probably won't hear horrible clipping. It's doing fancy floating point back, so that doesn't happen. But let's look at the chain here. And this would be kind of, it could blend into the mastering concept. First of all, flip off those clips. Turn on this limiter to show what it's doing. See that visual indication of how much it's cutting off. All these plugins will have different fun ways of showing you what they're doing. But the idea is, it is preventing the signal from going over the top, right? Here's some of that gentle glue everything together compression that we can put on the whole thing. And not that we'll even hear it, but the idea is it's not doing much, right? It's just a subtle little bit. A low ratio, it's like under 2. We could make it do too much. Sounds weird. Maybe one of these mastering equalizers with just gentle little changes here and there. Might not even hear. And just to illustrate that at the very end, I've got a loudness monitor here. Over the medium term, the short term, and integrated, kind of the whole thing. Broadcast standard is -23 LUFS, loudness units full scale. But I kind of pick one, like -17 or -18 when I'm doing our podcasts. When you upload your stuff, it may change the overall volume anyway to match everything else. But that would be a good way of seeing how you're doing with a certain target. And let's even render this little mini part of our project. Got my time selection there. I'll put it on the desktop. I could choose my sample rate, right, 44 or any one of these exciting numbers. Stereo, Okay. Might even choose a secondary output format here. An MP3, will you stop that? MP3, I can change my bit rate here, how hard it works on making it sound good. And in Reaper, and maybe others, don't have a lot of experience, but I can also force it to normalize afterward to a certain loudness units target and throw in a limiter at the end. That sounds good, so let's render these files. There we go, it shows me what it was doing. We have our file. Good for us. And again, all this is just an intro and we sweep through it quickly. There are lots of ways to get very interested in this stuff, and I'll show you some resources. But to jump right back, if you are podcasting, and you may be, how it works roughly. So here's you down at the bottom, you got your audio file. You have yourself a podcast host, a service that will keep your files on the internet and do a lot of other good things for you so that people can find your podcast. You upload your episode file that you finished and rendered and all that, your WAV or your MP3, and they do two things with that. One, store it on their servers so that when the public goes to get it, they can get it. And these servers can handle serving a lot. They also produce an RSS feed for you, really simple syndication, which is a XML organized way of telling a computer, this is the episode title, this is the description, all kinds of other metadata that the services down the road here will want to know about. So your podcast host is doing all this for you, keeping the audio files up there so you don't have to serve them yourself, and having an RSS feed that will tell the big podcast directories, Apple, Spotify, whoever else is doing this now, that this podcast exists, it's out in the world. And the podcast host may automate this process too. And otherwise, you might have to tell Apple themselves, hey, I have a podcast, here's proof that I operate it, and they'll evaluate it and add it to the directory, but your host may do this for you as well. So this way can end up in Apple Podcasts, formerly iTunes, Spotify. People can find it, people can subscribe, people get notified when you have a new episode going up, and then it gets to your listeners. My magnifier's still on. Okay, and then it gets to your happy listeners. See, so the directories don't actually host the file. They know where it is thanks to the RSS feed and point the listeners to it through their app. That's how it all works. So really what it boils down to is if you want a podcast, you got to find yourself a host. There are a whole bunch of these because everybody has a podcast now, whether they need one or not. We at the library happen to use Libsyn, Liberated Syndication, and they do all this for, like, we send up an episode, send up our art, they make the RSS feed, they make sure Apple and Spotify and everybody knows. There are a whole bunch. I don't know that one is horrible and one is much better than anything else. Blueberry, Buzzsprout, Podbean, etc. Do yourself some web searching and you'll can't swing a cat without hitting a podcast hosting service. You might be podcasting with your buddies right in the same place. That's great. You might need to be talking to someone through the Zooms, through the Skypes, through the whatevers. They're far away. But audio, like Zoom, our friend, is usually terrible for those because that's not what they're intended for. There's a whole bunch of services that will help capture really good audio or the best possible audio at the source on that computer and then give it to you later so you can make the best possible recording and cobble it together. Zencaster, Ringer, Squadcast, Riverside. Oh my God, there are so many of these now. And just for some general advice, I again want to plug NPR. There's a book that Glenn Weldon of the Pop Culture Happy Hour has on the Podcast Startup Guide. And again, NPR's Guide to Student Podcasting is pretty good to get you started on recording tips and in thinking about a podcast. I'm not like a podcast promoting, designing kind of a person. I'm the I want to twiddle the knobs audio weirdo. So can't give you a lot of advice on how to maximize your potential, grow your audience, all that. We have very small audiences for our podcast, and I don't care. It's okay. But listen to our podcasts. They're great. Some less specific resources, so not just podcasting. I love the Bedroom Producers blog for those. They alert you to a lot of great free plugins if you want to experiment with them. The Home Recording Forum, if you want to wade into an online forum, it's a pretty nice one. I just found this resource, My New Microphone, which is about more than that. I was reading up on different compressor types, and there's a lot of great information there if you want to dive deeper. I like to learn a lot from YouTube. Home Studio Corner, that guy's very nice. Audio Haze. Audio University is one I just stumbled across. This is also pretty great. Julian Kraus does a lot of very specific, rigorous testing of equipment, usually interfaces, if that part appeals to you. Or just get a Focusrite Scarlett series, the little red ones. They're great. And Booth Junkie is a guy who does voiceover spoken word stuff, a freelancer. A lot of people do this out of their homes, right? And so if that has any kind of spoken word stuff, and particularly if you want to do that sort of thing, voiceover for any number of clients, he's great for all aspects of that. But of course, Dead Tree Media Still, Recording Magazine, Sound on Sound Magazine, their books by Mike Sr. I like these. These are my personal ones. Bobby Owsinski has a bunch of books too, recording, mixing, all that good stuff. The library, I made sure we have some of those books here. And one more thing to plug about the library. LinkedIn Learning, formerly lynda.com, has a whole bunch of video recording courses taught by actual professionals that you can follow along with at your own pace and learn a whole lot, from beginner to very advanced. And that's about it for this time. Thank you very much. That's a lot of information again. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions. Please do email me and ask away if you want more clarification on what I was talking about or whatever. A reminder, you'll get the goodie bag of this whole presentation to look at the charts and such, as well as the recording of today's session.